Let's dive into a legal story that's so bizarre it almost sounds made up. It's a tale about a huge political fight, a colonial past, and an international court that pretty much ended up contradicting itself. This is the absolutely fascinating story of the Southwest Africa cases at the International Court of Justice. So, here's the central puzzle we're going to unravel today. It sounds like a riddle, right? But this actually happened. It's a real-life legal thriller that played out on the world stage, and honestly, experts are still arguing about it decades later. Okay, to really get what's going on, we have to understand something called the mandate system. You know, after World War I, the new League of Nations had a problem: what to do with all these former German and Ottoman territories. They came up with this idea where advanced nations would govern them, not as colonies, but as a sacred trust to help the people living there. So that sacred trust idea sounds pretty noble, doesn't it? But what happens when someone says that trust has been broken? Well, that's exactly what put this entire system on trial. So in November of 1960, two former members of the old League of Nations, Ethiopia and Liberia, did something huge. They actually sued South Africa at the International Court of Justice. They accused South Africa of totally failing its duties in what we now call Namibia, saying they had shattered that sacred trust. But hold on. Before the court could even get into whether South Africa was guilty or not, South Africa's lawyers tried to shut the whole thing down. They wanted the case thrown out on a bunch of technicalities. This was the first big fight. South Africa basically came out with four main arguments to get the case dismissed. They said, look, the mandate died when the League of Nations died. They said Ethiopia and Liberia couldn't sue because they weren't members of the League anymore. They were pretty much trying every legal door to say the court had no business hearing this case at all. So it all boiled down to this one crucial question. Was the mandate still legally alive? South Africa insisted that once the League was gone, any obligation for them to be judged by a court was gone too. But in 1962, the court said, nope, not so fast. It found the mandate was still a living, breathing international agreement, and its rules, including the rule about facing the court, had been passed on to the new United Nations system. And boom, this was a massive win for Ethiopia and Liberia. The court officially said, yes, we have the power to hear this case. The world was watching, and everyone thought, okay, here we go. Now we'll finally get a ruling on what South Africa is actually doing in Southwest Africa. But here's the crazy part. The decision was unbelievably close. It passed by a single vote, 8-7. Just think about that. One judge changing their mind would have ended the whole case right then and there. It was that tight. So, with that hurdle cleared, the case moved forward for 4 more years. We're talking thousands and thousands of pages of arguments about the real heart of the matter. Everyone was on the edge of their seat, waiting for the final verdict. And you can just see the long road this took. After that green light in 1962, the whole question changed. It wasn't, can the court hear this anymore? It was, okay, what's the verdict going to be? Then, on July 18, 1966, the court dropped an absolute bombshell. It rejected the case completely. But not because it decided South Africa was innocent. Oh no, it was for this wild reason. The court said Ethiopia and Liberia had no legal right or interest to even bring the complaint in the first place. And get this, after all that time, the judges were split exactly down the middle. 7 votes to one side, 7 to the other. A perfect deadlock. Can you imagine? So what happens in a tie? Well, the court's president, in this case, Sir Percy Spender from Australia, gets what's called a casting vote. It's the tiebreaker. And his single vote swung the entire case, dismissing the claims and basically handing South Africa the win. Okay, so how could this possibly happen? How can a court say in 1962, yes, come on in, we can hear your case, and then in 1966 say, wait, you don't actually have a right to be here? The legal gymnastics behind this are the real core of this whole mystery. The court's 1966 logic all came down to a distinction it made between 2 different kinds of rules in the mandate. On one hand, you had the conduct provisions. That's the sacred trust stuff, about how you treat the people. On the other hand, you had special interests provisions, things that protected the specific rights of other countries, like trade. So here's the twist. The court said that countries like Ethiopia and Liberia could only sue to protect their own stuff, their special interests. They didn't have the individual right to sue just to enforce the sacred trust. That job, the court argued, belonged only to the League of Nations as a whole. And since the League was gone, well, that right to sue was gone too. In a way, the court was saying the 1962 decision just meant they had a ticket to get into the courthouse. But the 1966 decision said they didn't have a right to actually argue their case once they were inside. As you can imagine, this decision didn't just end the story. It sent absolute shockwaves across the entire world of international law. The fallout was huge, and people are still debating the court's bizarre logic to this day. Now, the judges who voted to dismiss the case defended themselves. They basically said, look, we're not lawmakers. Our job isn't to invent new legal rights just because it feels like the right thing to do. We just have to apply the law as it's written, even if the result feels wrong. And that leaves us with the big, lingering question. Was this just a case of judges being incredibly strict and technical with the law? Or was the court, facing a massive political firestorm and a split decision, just looking for a legal escape hatch to avoid a major showdown? That's what makes this case so unforgettable, not just for what it decided, but for the huge questions it raises about what international justice really is.